Welcome back to Talkers of the Flower Moon. This is a podcast where we break down Killers of the Flower Moon, a book by David Grann. I'm your host, Anson, and I'm here with you today with my co-host, Laura.
Hey everyone, I'm Laura, and today we're joined by our guests, Alex and James.
Hi, I'm Alex.
Hi, I'm James.
And today we are going to have a deep dive into the book's major themes and talk about how they connect to ideas like power, identity, and the unfair judicial system of the US during the 20th century. These are pretty big topics, so it's going to be a really interesting conversation if you'll stay with us.
Before we start, let's do a quick summary of Killers of the Flower Moon. The story takes place in the 1920s in Oklahoma, and it tells the real-life story of the Osage murders and the FBI investigation that followed. Some key people in the book include Molly Bookhart, an Osage woman whose family was a target in the murders, Tom White, the FBI agent who worked hard to solve the case, and William Hale, a powerful man who is behind the violence. The book uncovers a horrible conspiracy against the Osage people who were being killed for their oil wells.
And that's what makes this book so disturbing. As it goes on, you start to see that it's not just a few random murders. It's part of a bigger, darker plot. What's especially upsetting is that the Osage couldn't get the protection they needed from the law because of the racial segregation they faced. This makes them easy targets for theft, scams, attacks, which eventually led to the murders. The whole situation just shows how much racism and greed played a role in what happened to the Osage people. So why were the Osage people so rich?
The Osage people became very wealthy when oil was discovered under the land in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Because they owned the rights to the land, they earned a lot of money from oil companies that wanted to drill there. At one point, they were some of the richest people per person in the entire world. They had nice homes, expensive cars, and access to good education. But this wealth also made them targets for people who wanted to take advantage of them.
Yeah, imagine suddenly becoming one of the richest people in the country, but instead of celebrating, you have to constantly look over your shoulder. Honestly, it's terrifying. And the U.S. government believed that Native Americans couldn't manage their own money, so they created a system where white guardians controlled Osage's wealth. These guardians had complete control over how much money the Osage could use and what they could spend it on. This made the Osage extremely vulnerable, and instead of protecting them, the system made it easier for others to steal from them or take control of their money through lies, fraud, and even violence.
That's honestly quite crazy how they had millions of dollars but just couldn't spend any of it without getting someone else's permission.
Exactly. I have to ask my parents for permission, but these people are should be completely independent, but no, instead they're controlled by these white guardians who are also corrupt and wanted to take advantage of them. They tricked the Osage into signing away their land or forced them into bad financial deals. Even worse, some people went as far as marrying Osage individuals just so they could gain control of their wealth. And in some horrifying cases, Osage people were murdered so that their oil money could be inherited by white relatives or guardians. The Osage were being targeted simply because they were rich, and the system allowed this to happen.
And it's wild, because you hear about greed in history, but this wasn't just about money. It was a full-on conspiracy. It wasn't one or two bad guys, but it was an entire system working against them. And the scary part is that a lot of people knew what was happening and just looked the other way.
Yeah, and I think that's what makes the story more disturbing. It wasn't just random criminals committing these murders. It was people the Osage trusted. Their own doctors, lawyers, and even family members were involved. And what's even worse is that because the police and courts didn't do much to stop it, many of the crimes were ignored because of racism, and the people responsible for stealing from or even killing the Osage got away with it. Some cases were never even investigated properly. The Osage lost not only their wealth but also their safety, their dignity, and even their lives.
Their lives sucked. It's just straight up evil.
Yeah, and it wasn't until the FBI finally got involved in the 1920s, but some of these crimes were taken more seriously than others, even though they all should have been taken more seriously. They're able to bring some criminals to justice, but by then, so much damage has already been done. Many Osage families had lost everything, and most of the stolen money was never returned. This part of history shows just how unfairly Native Americans were treated and how greed and racism has shaped the way that they were exploited.
And let's be real, it's not like these issues just disappeared after the 1920s. Native communities are still dealing with stolen land, missing people, and government systems that fail them. The Osage murders are just one example of how powers were used to take advantage of indigenous people.
That's pretty bad. The Osage people should have been able to enjoy their wealth, but instead, They were taken advantage of and even killed for it. It's sad to see how many people used power and corruption to steal from them.
It's infuriating, but that's why books like Killers of the Flower Moon are so important. They bring attention to these hidden parts of history that we need to talk about.
And exactly, that's why we're here, to break it down and make sure these stories aren't forgotten. Well, I did hear there was an important character in the story known as William Hale. What did he do?
William Hale is a central figure in the story, and his actions are key to the Osage murders. On the surface, Hale appeared to be a respectable businessman. Some people trusted in the community. He was known for being helpful and friendly, always offering support to the Osage people who are relatively isolated and in need of support. But behind that friendly image, he was actually the mastermind behind all the murders. Hale was extremely cunning and manipulative. He had a plan to gain control of the Osage's wealth, and he worked slowly and carefully to put that plan into action. The Osage people had become incredibly wealthy due to the oil found on their land. But Hale saw this wealth as an opportunity to exploit them. He didn't just take their money outright. He used his influence and kindness to get close to them and gain their trust. By offering to manage their finances and help with their daily needs, he made the Osage feel like they owe him something.
It's crazy how Hale was able to manipulate the situation to his advantage. While he was pretending to be a helpful and trustworthy person, he was actually scheming behind the scenes to steal their wealth. He took control of their head rights, which were the legal rights to their oil money, without them even realizing what was happening at first. He wasn't just after the money, he wanted full control of their lives and everything they owned. He understood how much power they held because of their wealth, and he wanted to take the power for himself. And the worst part was that Hale wasn't doing this alone. He had connections to the local law enforcement and criminal gangs, which made him incredibly powerful. These connections allowed him to protect himself and continue his crimes without a fear of getting caught.
So you're telling me the local police were either corrupt or just completely ignored the crimes that were happening?
Yeah.
Dang. So that means he must have known that the Osage people were in a tight spot because of the racism they faced, and he was able to use that to his advantage. The law was just not on their side, and that makes it so much easier for him to carry out his true plan. He was able to exploit the corruption within the system and build an empire out of it.
Yeah, I honestly agree. Like, the legal system wasn't just failing the Osage, it was enabling people like Hale to commit these crimes. Law enforcement and the courts allowed him to manipulate the system, and the Osage had no way of protecting themselves. They were trapped in a system that didn't serve them. Hale's ability to get away with murder for so long is like a perfect example of how corruption within institutions can create a huge power imbalance and allows powerful individuals to exploit and harm others without consequences.
This ties directly into the central question we're exploring. To what extent do these institutions contribute to power imbalances? Our legal and justice system, which are supposed to protect people and hold criminals accountable, instead just allow this guy to walk around and take control of the Osage people, ultimately giving him the ability to just take their lives. The system is not very well designed at this time, giving people like Hale power to just being able to do whatever he wants without any real punishment.
Now let's take a closer look at the key players in the story and what motivated them to act the way they did. Hale's motivations were driven by greed and the thirst for power. He wasn't just after money, he wanted complete control over the Osage people. By controlling their wealth and using his influence, he was able to keep them trapped in a situation where they had no way out. His actions show how dangerous unchecked power can be, especially when the systems that are supposed to protect people fail them.
Now, let's talk about some of the key characters that bring Killers of the Flower Moon to life. First up, Ernest Bouchard. A complicated one, isn't he?
Yeah, at first he seems like a man caught in the middle. He's torn between his love for Molly and his loyalty to his uncle, William Hale. He marries Molly, an Osage woman, and appears to care about her. But as the story unfolds, we realize he's not just a passive bystander. He plays a much bigger role in the crimes than we first suspect.
He's not just a simple character. He has an internal conflict. There are moments where you almost sometimes feel bad for him because he was, in fact, manipulated by his uncle, Hale. But then you have to take a step back and look at the full picture. You remember that he actively took part in harming many Osage people that he claimed to have cared about. He wasn't a victim of circumstance. He made choices, and those choices had very devastating consequences.
Exactly. And then there's Molly. She's really the heart of the story.
Yeah, absolutely. Molly's strength is incredible. She loses so much, her sisters, other members of her family, but yet she never gives up. Even when she's surrounded by danger and doesn't know who to trust, she keeps pushing for justice. It's her determination that helps bring attention to these crimes.
And then there's the main antagonist of the story, William Hale. He's one of the most chilling figures because he doesn't come across as a violent criminal at first.
I agree. On the surface, Hale presents himself as a successful businessman who was a friend to the Osage people, helping them with their daily needs. But underneath that friendly persona, he is a cold, calculated person who's just driven by greed. He just wants money and control, and he's willing to take control of any person he is, even going as far as to killing people to get whatever he wants. That's what makes him a terrifying character. He represents a larger corruption and racism in the system of the US and allows these crimes to happen in the first place.
Exactly. This wasn't just one bad person taking advantage of a situation. This was an entire system that failed the Osage people. And speaking of justice, we have Tom White, the lawman who investigates these murders.
Tom White is an interesting character in this story because he's different from the local law enforcement. He comes from a tough background. His father was a prison warden, and he grew up mostly around criminals, so he knew how to deal with dangerous people quite well. Before joining the Bureau of Investigation, he worked as a Texas Ranger, where he learned to track criminals and solve crimes in the rough conditions of old Texas. But law enforcement back then was very different from today. There wasn't a strong national police force yet. Most places just had local sheriffs or town officials who were usually often corrupt. White wanted something better, which is why he joined the early FBI under J. Edgar Hoover.
Right, he's determined to solve this case, but he's also a product of his time. While he does seek justice for the Osage, he's operating in a system that often overlooked and mistreated Native American communities.
And we can't forget about the victims. One of the most powerful things about Killers of the Flower Moon is that it doesn't just focus on the criminals, it gives voice to the people who suffered. Grant makes sure that we don't just see them as statistics, but we see them as real people with families, hopes, and lives that were stolen from them.
That's what makes this story so heartbreaking and important. It's not just about one crime, it's a long history of injustice. The Osage murders reveal so much about America in the early 20th century. Racism, corruption, greed, and the struggle for justice.
I agree. That's why Killers of the Flower Moon is such an important book. It reminds us that history isn't just about dates and facts. It's about real people, real struggles, and the impacts these events have on people.
Hey listeners, love Talkers of the Flower Moon? Wish you could rep your favorite podcast? Well, now you can with our exclusive Talkers of the Flower Moon merch.
We've got everything from t-shirts, hoodies, and water bottles.
Act fast because these deals disappear faster than the evidence in the Osage murder investigation.
Visit totallynotarealwebsite.com and use code FlowerMoon10 for absolutely nothing because this is a fake commercial. Now back to the podcast.
This book really highlights on how bad the lives of the Osage people had become. The Osage people were treated less than human, and when oil was discovered on their land, instead of respecting their rights to officially own that money, the U.S. government cracked down on the Osage people, trying to make it so that they had as little control over their own wealth as they possibly could. The Osage people had money, but they weren't able to really spend it however they wished.
Yeah, and that relates to the larger question here. How do political, economic, and cultural systems create power imbalances? The Osage had their own land and wealth, but the government set up a system that made it impossible for them to use their money freely. The courts, which could have and should have protected them, failed to deliver justice. Instead of stopping these murderers, authorities ignored the crimes or even participated in the corruption. And in the society, many white Americans saw Osage people as undeserving of their wealth because they were sent to a worthless land in Oklahoma and there happened to be oil there. And that mindset made it easier for people to justify stealing from them, whether it was through legal means like guardianships or through murder.
And this isn't just history. It still happens today. Who gets to have power and wealth is often tied to race and history. The Osage murders weren't just random, but they were just the result of a system that saw Native people as less important. We can see similar patterns in other parts of history, like the way Black Americans were denied home ownership through reading, or how Native American children were taken from their families and forced into boarding schools. Even now, people of color face economic barriers because of policies that were put in place decades ago.
That's a pretty interesting point you got there, James. The book makes it clear that racism isn't just about individuals being prejudiced against. It's about systems that take advantage of certain groups and benefit upon others. In this case, the system was built upon to keep power in the hands of white guardians and government officials while stripping the Osage people of their ability to control their own wealth and lives. Even though the Osage people had money, they were still treated as inferior.
And the fact that the Osage had to rely on the FBI for justice is another example of how systems of power work. The local government wasn't interested in helping, and law enforcement in the area was either corrupt or indifferent. It took an outside federal agency to investigate, and even then, justice was incomplete. Many of the perpetrators got away with the crimes, and the families of the victims never received full closure. That tells us a lot about who the justice system and was designed to protect.
Exactly. These crimes had happened to wealthy white Americans, the response would have been completely different. But because the victims were Native Americans and their lives were viewed as less valuable, the book forces us to think about how justice is often unevenly applied depending on the race and social status.
It also kind of raises a question of how we remember history. These events weren't widely known before the book was published, and that kind of says quite a lot about how these stories are told and which are told, which are ignored. If we don't talk about these things, how will we remember them?
And that's why books like this are so important, because they don't just tell a story, they make us question the systems that we live in today. What policies exist now that might be disadvantaging certain groups? How do you make sure history doesn't repeat itself? These are kind of conversations we need to have.
Yeah, and it's not just about Native Americans. We see power imbalances in different ways across different communities. Whether it's immigration laws, voting rights, or economic opportunities, race and power are always connected.
It's unfortunate that these problems have existed for a long period of time, but it is important today that we bring awareness, especially in cases that this book tells us about. The more we know about this history, the harder it is for us to ignore them.
Definitely. So as we wrap up, let's talk about the book's impact. What do we take away from the story, and why does it matter today?
This episode of Talkers of the Flower Moon is brought to you by Gatorade.
Whether you're pushing through a long day of school, powering through a workout, or just need a boost, Gatorade keeps you hydrated and ready to go with essential electrolytes and refreshing flavors.
I'm all about the cool blue, honestly, James. It's smooth, crisp, and keeps me feeling fresh when I need it most.
Yeah, but for me though, Fruit Punch is undefeated. If you haven't tried it yet, you're seriously missing out.
Grab a Gatorade at your local store or order online today. Stay hydrated, stay fueled, and stay ahead. Now back to the episode.
So, any final thoughts? Anything that the audience should take away from this podcast that they're listening to right now?
Honestly, Anson, thank you for having me on the podcast. Honestly, I think it was a great story, great book. But one thing that stood out to me was how deeply embedded racism was or currently is in the legal and financial systems. Like, I feel like you look at American history, you wouldn't believe that racism is everywhere. Like, you think maybe it's just in work or in these places, but in financial institutions, like, I don't know, just it's not a real place I think about racism, because it's just money. It wasn't just individuals making bad choices. It was an entire structure designed to keep the Osage people from having control from their own lives.
It's a powerful reminder that history repeats itself unless we confront these power structures. If we don't acknowledge these patterns and work to change them, they'll just keep happening in different ways.
For me, it was shocking to realize how much was covered up. The fact that so many people knew what was happening but did nothing shows how complicity allows injustice to thrive. And it makes me think about what injustices today we might be ignoring.
Probably the greatest takeaway you can take from this is just that people have to fight for the justice they desire. The Osage people had to fight for anyone to investigate their cases, and even then they didn't get the full support that they needed. It's a reminder that we just have to keep questioning what systems that of governing bodies that we work with, and just hopefully try to make sure that they have accountability for their actions. Thanks for listening in to Talkers of the Flower Moon. Be sure to check us out on our next episode and follow us for more. Thank you.